Even as the US empire's gaze turns towards Venezuela, it continues to meddle in Africa. Foreign intervention is fueling a bitter civil war inside of Sudan right now, and the Trump administration is pushing a line about a genocide against Christians in Nigeria. With an eye on military intervention and across the Sahel region, anti-imperialist forces continue to rise and organize, dreaming of a united Pan-African continent that will resist US imperialism and reject Israeli colonization. Here to talk to me more about this is Ahmed Kaballo. He is a British Sudanese journalist and the CEO and co-founder of African Stream, and of course, a friend of Mint Press News. African Stream, as many of you know, was a media outlet shut down by the US government for publishing inconvenient truths. Welcome to the show, Ahmed.
Thank you, Mnar. And I'm so glad that you guys are still on Instagram. You gave us all a scare when they took you down, but luckily they put you straight back up.
Yeah, the timing was very interesting because I had just returned from Silicon Valley when we got taken down on Instagram, talking about, U.S.-Israeli Unit 8200 inside of Silicon Valley. But we're back and we're here, and we will continue to talk about the forever war machine. I think a lot of people's eyes right now are on three different places. One of them, of course, is Venezuela, with the United States shutting down the airspace there. But then what has really captured the hearts and minds of the globe has been this humanitarian crisis inside of Sudan, which is such a tragedy. But I think a lot of people forget, or might not even know, just how much of that is the result of US imperialism for decades to turn Sudan into the failed state it is today. Right now, the Sudanese government forces have been battling the rebel faction, the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. And the RSF is now in control of much of the southwest of the country. So we'd love to get your expertise as somebody who covers Africa. You are Sudanese as well. So could you just tell us, how did we get to this humanitarian crisis that we see today?
Well, it's a long story. In 2011, Sudan was broken into two republics, the Republic of Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. Since then, we've had two civil wars in the south and now a proxy war in the north. South Sudan, according to the World Bank, last year was declared the world's poorest country. Sudan, according to the UN, is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So by any measure, any way you look at it, it's been a disaster for both countries. And instrumental in the division of the two Sudans was the evangelical right from the United States. Constantly, they played adverts of, we need to stop the massacre of Christians by the Arabs and the Muslims in the north. It doesn't mean that wasn't true, but it was an oversimplistic analysis of what was going on, which was essentially a fight for people's rights, for people's autonomous rights, for people's rights to live freely and in dignity in their own land. It wasn't just about religion. There was a lot more complex economic, political reasons for, the two bloody civil wars that had happened in Sudan since 1956, when the country became independent. So the US pushed for this separation. The Israelis supported the rebel groups in both civil wars. So the first civil war that broke out soon after independence, and then the second civil war, where both rebel groups were supported by the Israelis under the guise of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And the Israelis would constantly use Sudan as a distraction. So whenever people talk about the real Israeli apartheid, they'd say, well, it's nothing compared to the Arab apartheid that the Christians of South Sudan are facing in Sudan. Again, I'm not saying this to belittle the discrimination that South Sudanese people face, because it was real. But it was definitely a ploy used by the Israelis to not only demonize Islam, demonize a country that historically always stood with Palestine, but also to divert attention. Whataboutery. What's going on in Palestine isn't bad. What's going on in Sudan is worse. Was a constant tactic used by Israeli officials. And so then once Sudan was divided, the oil revenues, 75% of the oil revenues also went, because they exist in South Sudan. The pipelines run through the north, but still the oil money that propped up the Bashir regime was gone. And so the corrupt Bashir regime really struggled to provide just the basic necessities, as well as keeping this military apparatus that keeps him in power in check. So there was, rebellions that were popping out in different parts of the country. The rebellion in Darfur started in 2003, but the rebellion in the Nuba Mountains restarted. The rebellion in the Blue Nile started, and the north was just engulfed in conflict and destabilization from that point. Then came the December revolution that happened at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And, Bashir was toppled by his generals and the leader of the RSF, Hemeti. And we had this strange situation where there was a power sharing agreement between a transitional civilian government and the military. Now, during that time came the Abraham Accords. So it was a very interesting thing to witness, because I interviewed the spokesman for the transitional civilian government, who's also the information minister at the time. And I asked him, how come you decided to normalize relations with Israel when you're not an elected government, but you're a transitional government? And he broke it down and he said, in the lead up to the 2020 presidential elections in the US, normalization wasn't linked to taking Sudan off the state sponsor of terror. So the conditions were compensation for 9/11 victims, liberalization of some laws, the dress code, etc., etc. It wasn't an official condition, but an unofficial condition, moving away from the Islamic Republic of Iran, which happened in 2015. But normalization wasn't explicitly part of it. Then as the elections were coming up, Mike Pompeo, who was the US Secretary of State at the time, said, no, if you want the state sponsor of terror designation lifted, you have to join the Abraham Accords and you have to normalize relations with Israel. Initially, they refused and said, this is a decision to be taken by an elected government, not by a transitional one. But at the time, Sudan's, and this is coming from Faisal Mohammed Saleh, the information minister, not my words. He says at the time, Sudanese economy was free falling, and they were concerned that if they were to wait for the results of the election, number one, Trump could come back in and say, no, you have to normalize relations, so they've just wasted time. And number two, Biden might continue the same policy. And the Sudanese economy was free falling, which was just weakening the transitional civilian government and strengthening the armed forces in the country, principally the military and the militia, which was meaning the process of transition to civilian government was becoming more unlikely. So they reluctantly agreed to the Abraham Accords, which all it did was, amongst the Sudanese masses, it meant the transitional civilian government had just lost all credibility, because not only did they say they weren't going to do this, but now they did it, and they kind of went back on everything that they said in public, that this is a decision to be taken by an elected government, not a transitional government. So Israel and US has played a pivotal role in everything that we see happening. We saw an agreement for a Russian naval base by the Sudanese military. The Sudanese ambassador that had not been in the country for many years due to the West falling out with Omar al-Bashir's regime, came back to the country and said, if you do this, it will be a huge, huge mistake. And before we know it, the country is engulfed in war. So and in countries engulfed in war, with both sides at the start of the war having the backing of key US allies. So at the start of the war, it was Egypt backing the Sudanese army, key US ally, the largest beneficiary of US military aid in Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, as the wars transpired, the Sudanese armies had new partners: Algeria, Iran, Russia. But at the beginning, that was it, and they did nothing to stop the war. And as the wars transpired, and we've seen the UAE loot gold from Sudan. The UAE is now the second largest exporter of gold in the world. But if you travel up and down the United Arab Emirates, you won't find a single gold mine. So you can only imagine how that happens. It funnels weapons to the rapid support forces via Chad, via Uganda, and allegedly by Ethiopia. The US could make one phone call and stop its ally, but it refuses to. And what we've seen recently is that Donald Trump says, if you want peace, then we're going to have to get something for that peace. Much similar to what we saw with the fake peace deal conducted between Rwanda and Congo, where it was, we'll provide you security from our principal ally in the region, Rwanda, if you give up mining concessions and concessions for critical minerals in the Congo. So that it looks like that is the move that Donald Trump is trying to negotiate in Sudan. But obviously the Sudanese people are not for it, especially because there's not been any peace in Congo since the peace deal that was signed in June. M23, which is a Rwandan-backed militia force, still controls Goma and much as Eastern Congo. People are still being essayed. People are still being killed. People are still displaced internally and externally. So it's not even a real peace. So yeah, that's the situation, and it's a sad situation for anyone that's concerned about what's going on in Sudan.
And I can imagine that the Sudanese people, of course, would reject any normalization with Israel and any sort of like peace broker deal by the United States, like you mentioned, because Sudan has such a strong tradition of being a progressive country. Most people don't even realize this. Sudan has been one of the most progressive countries in Africa and has been a very, very strong backer of resistance against US imperialism. And so, and also in supporting, Palestine's right to resist, Israeli occupation. Can you talk more about that history, that unknown history that we rarely hear about?
Sure, but it's a complicated history because I wouldn't describe Omar al-Bashir's regime as anti-imperialist. When I was in Sudan in 2017, there were adverts on Sudanese television encouraging people to pick up arms and go fight for jihad in Syria. And as you've covered extensively on Mint Press, Operation Sycamore, which was a US-backed, Obama-backed $1 billion operation, was bringing fighters from all over the world to topple the Bashar al-Assad. Timber Sycamore, that's it. Thank you. Yeah. Precisely because of Assad's protection of resistance groups and support of resistance groups. So there's that. There was also a member of the PFLP group, a resistance group in Palestine, a Venezuelan by the name of Carlos the Jackal. He went to Sudan to take refuge, and he was drugged by the Sudanese government and handed over to France. And he still sits in French prison to this day. No trial, no fair jury, no trial of his peers. So it's complicated. Of course, Sudan holds the Muslim Brotherhood banner, and as part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, you have to talk about Palestine. You have to talk about Palestine to have legitimacy in your own country. I'm sure at some point we'll see Ahmed Shara, the self-declared president of Syria, talk about Palestine. But that being said, it did play quite an interesting role in the sense of Sudan, the Republic of Sudan, North Sudan, is majority Sunni, but it didn't take a sectarian line on this initially. Of course, this changed in 2015.
And you're talking about Syria.
I'm talking
Oh,
about
Iran.
Iran.
Okay.
Close relationships. He had close relationships with Iran. While a lot of the Sunni regimes in the area rejected any sort of association with Iran, purely on sectarian violence. So he did have a good relationship with Iran. Iran apparently used Sudan as a conduit to provide weapons to resistance. How much, how extensive that is, we don't know. Israel definitely used that as a pretext to push Bill Clinton to bomb Sudan's largest pharmaceutical factory in 1998, shortly after the Monica Lewinsky affair, but that's a story for another day. So yeah, it's a complicated history. And then, of course, we all know one of the most revolutionary movements in the whole region is the Houthi Ansar Allah movement. The Houthis had to fight Sudanese soldiers in Yemen who were sent by Omar al-Bashir. So what happened, I guess what people might not understand is there was a split in Sudan between Hassan al-Turabi, who was allegedly a real believer of, the Muslim Brotherhood cause and the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Sudan, who was obviously very keen on supporting the Palestinian cause, and Omar al-Bashir, who was a general that used the language and the clothing of the Brotherhood to maintain power. As soon as Hassan al-Turabi was kicked out of the movement, then we started to see the moves of Bashir sending foot soldiers to fight in Yemen, to fight the Houthi Ansar Allah on behalf of the Saudi and UAE axis. So it's complicated. It's complicated. It's not like a Chavez, where from 1998 until the day they've passed, consistently been on the anti-imperialist side. And there's a lot of flip-flopping and attempts of rapprochement and trying to get back in the Westist camp. And that actually ended up being his downfall. So in 2015, they kind of cut off relations with Iran and pivoted towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This was done precisely to hold on to power, thinking that I'm better with the West. If I do rapprochement with the West, I can get the sanctions relieved. I can I can get some of that Gulf Arab money. But when he did that, he provided foot soldiers in Yemen. He was promised by the Saudis and the UAE, if you do this for us, we've got Washington's ear. We'll get you back into the camp. The leader of the Rapid Support Forces, who was working for Hemeti at the time, who was working for Bashir at the time, who's now leading the Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti, he had lobbied and employed a Canadian lobby firm called Dickinson Madison, and there was a former ex-Israeli spy called Ari Ben Benashe, who was paid a fee of $1 million to get the Bashir regime an audience with Donald Trump. Of course, that didn't materialize. Of course, that led to nothing. But it showed the lengths and depths that they were trying to go to get back into Washington's good books. And actually, why they did that, they kind of let their defenses down. And this is what led to the United Arab Emirates courting Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, aka Hemeti, and making him their man in Sudan, who would then turn on Bashir and be involved in the coup that would topple him at the end of 2019, at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019.
And Ahmed, I did that explainer on Sudan. We all know that the second a nation begins to turn to the US to make these processions, that's really when the United States topples those governments. We saw that in Syria when even Bashar al-Assad, when he just started to say, you know what, let me try to get what I can get out of the Saudis since we're sanctioned to help rebuild our country. Next thing you know, he's, running away to Russia, and he's been removed. And now we have Ahmed al-Shara. Same thing with Gaddafi. The second he started to make, processions, he was, his country was turned into a failed state and bombed endlessly by NATO, and he was sodomized and dragged through the streets. And so I think the lesson here is the United States is not on your side. They're not going to be on your side. They don't forget that your country stood against them at one point, and they're not going to work with you. And this is how the United States acts in these situations. And then we have countries like the UAE. You mentioned them earlier. Abu Dhabi right now is a major leading proxy actor for the United States in the Middle East. People kind of think like Saudi Arabia is like their main Gulf ally, but actually the UAE, I would say, is an even stronger ally to the United States in terms of carrying out, U.S. imperialist missions in the region. And we saw that in Yemen, and we're seeing that now, and we've been seeing it for decades now in Sudan. And so the UAE right now has been arming the RSF. They basically train them to become the military that they are today, that we've seen committing horrific crimes on camera, from rapings to executions on camera. And they're just like the Israelis. They're proudly posting them on their social media. Like, they're just totally proudly posting these crimes. And the UAE is the second largest exporter of gold in the world, and they don't even have any gold mines. None. They're getting this gold. They're extracting this gold illegally from Sudan while the people there are starving. I mean, when I look at images of Abu Dhabi, it just disgusts me how addicted they are to this wealth that doesn't even belong to them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, and it's not just in Sudan. It's they've got a whole Africa project right now. So they've been backing General Haftar in Libya. They've also now propping up Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, which the US is desperate to push into a confrontation with Eritrea, which historically is the only country in Africa that doesn't have any military-to-military alliance with AFRICOM. Niger was the second when they kicked out the AFRICOM base after the revolution, after the coup, and then the coup, which was a revolutionary coup. And they're just constantly causing problems. They pushed for recognition of Somaliland, which then, Somaliland's a breakaway territory of Somalia, which then forced the Somali president's hand. So now they've got good relations with Somalia, because Somalia doesn't want to see them kind of push for this fake recognition of an autonomous region of the country, which is still part of Somalia. And then they're using their company called Blue Carbon to offset their carbon credits by buying up arable and forest land throughout Africa. So they're buying up huge swathes of forest in Liberia, huge swathes of arable land in Kenya, huge swathes of arable land in Zambia and Zimbabwe. And they're using this to say, look, we don't have any problem with pollution, because we managed to offset our carbon credits with all of this arable land and forest land that we've got in Africa. What the UAE is basically trying to do, it's seen the playbook. It realizes, despite what the West says about models of development, most of the development comes through imperialism. Yeah, if we look at the G20, for example, if we look at the the so-called developed world, the France, UK, the US, Canada, Belgium, these are places that either have colonial history or neo-colonial or imperialist history. And so the UAE recognizes that if it really wants to develop, if it really wants to move beyond being a petrostate, it has to get more arable land in the African continent. It imports 90% of its food. The oil will eventually run out. When it will happen, different economists has predictions on when that will happen. Will it happen in the next 50 years, the next 100 years? But it definitely will run out. So they're trying to diversify their economy, not by producing different things, but by taking over other people's countries and taking over the industries. In Sudan, of course, it's the gold sector, but it's also the arable land, a place called Al Jazeera State. Sudan is the third largest country in Africa, but we have the largest arable land. Algeria is the largest country, but so much of it is desert. Congo, so much of it is forest, but we have huge farmland. And that was one of the first places that the RSF tried to take over. They were eventually pushed out by the Sudanese army last year. But still, it shows that the ambition isn't just gold. It isn't just the Red Sea. It's also the land. It's also the cattle. It's also food production. And yeah, it's allowed to do this because just was it recently on a trip to the White House, we saw Saudi Arabia pledge to give $1 trillion, the UAE pledged to give 600 million. This is basically the same structure of a mafia. In a mafia, you have the captain, you have the underboss, and then you have the boss. The captain kicks up to the underboss kicks up to the boss. In the situation of Sudan, the captain would be Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti. The underboss would be the UAE, and the final boss would be the United States. So, as much profit as the UAE is making out of our continent, best believe there's kickbacks provided to the person that allows them, the entity that allows them to operate in this way.
Well, and I think a lot of people forget, like you mentioned, like the US could just pick up the phone and end this crisis, but they won't because there's a lot at stake here in terms of the landscape, the minerals, the access points, and this pushback that we're seeing by the United States to push out China and Russia, countries across Africa and the global South in general are choosing to work with China and Russia because they're not necessarily threatening to overthrow their governments. They're more respectful of those countries' culture and traditions and are pulling people out of poverty. It's not perfect, but it does give these global South countries another option that is not US imperialism, because US imperialism has shown to benefit a very specific 1% and to plunder countries. The US does not want to see, and Israel, of course, and its proxies, don't want to see any country in the global South rise to its true potential. So how has that also played with this conflict in Sudan?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the conflict, like I said, it was difficult to see as it first started who was the US backing, where did the US interest lie in here. Both generals were involved in the normalization deal, the Abraham Accords. Both generals pushed it. Both generals celebrated it. But then, as the conflict developed and we started to see new players enter the field, for example, Algeria was supporting the Sudanese army, and the Russians were providing the Algerians with new fighter jets, and the Algerians were selling their old fighter jets to the Sudanese army. The Iranians were providing drone technology to the Sudanese army. Russia was providing logistical support to the Sudanese army. And once they started to see those types of players on one side of the army, on one side of the conflict, the US clearly started to shift and started to move towards the backing of the RSF via the UAE. And we've seen this in the latest peace deal. The latest peace deal talks about basically disarming the army, ridding the army of the Muslim Brotherhood, talking about it as an extremist group, but very little is said about the RSF. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of the show, the footage, the massacres, the sexual assault, etc. And the Sudanese people, by and large, support the Sudanese army, not because the army is perfect, because they see this as almost a second independence war, because we have a foreign-backed insurgency by a Gulf monarchy that's trying to take over our country. And while the Sudanese army is not perfect, we have primary contradiction, and the primary contradiction is defeating the RSF. So yeah, it's becoming more and more clearer. And even the Al Burhan, who's been very reserved in his criticism of the United States, was very, very clear in condemning them and condemning the US envoy, saying that the paper that they presented might as well been presented by the RSF and might as well have been presented by the UAE.
Yeah.
So it's not a neutral mediator. The RSF as well is starting to use the language of Israel. So there's an RSF spokesman on an Israeli television saying that the Sudanese army is the Hamas of Africa. So they're really trying to use the settler colonial conflict that's happening in Gaza and use that to push and sway the US to give them more support. The US has sanctioned RSF officials and RSF companies, but it's done it in a very tokenistic way. So they sanctioned RSF companies that are operating in the UAE, but have said nothing about the UAE. They sanctioned Hemeti's brother, but haven't sanctioned Hemeti. Everything about their engagement with Sudan right now seems to be a performance as opposed to a real attempt to stop the conflict. And I think what really is happening is there's probably behind the scene conversations happening with Al Burhan, and says, yeah, we've been very partisan with this. Yeah, we might have been fair, and we've not been fair, but you're mixing with fellows that we're not very appreciative of. So if you want to see the US more favorable towards the Sudanese army, you need to disassociate yourself from these entities that we have problems with, principally Algeria, Russia, and Iran.
And, my final question about Sudan, of course, we're going to talk about other topics, but on Sudan, you recently stated that the breakup of Sudan in 2011 into two countries, which, by the way, was very much influenced by the United States and Israel, turned into Sudan and South Sudan, has been a disaster for both, bringing with it division and increased rule and influence from the outside, like we just talked about. Do you think there's a need for people from both countries to at least explore the possibility of reunification at some stage in the future, to become a stronger united front in the face of this imperialist agenda to keep Sudan into a failed state?
Yeah, but I was quickly told by my South Sudanese friends there's no chance of that happening. Unfortunately, there were so many crimes committed by the northern elite against the people of South Sudan, and there was no real attempt to rectify, apologize, repair the damage, anything like that. And this is a recent conflict. So these are people's aunts, uncles, granddads that were brutalized. So that's the issue. But if we were to look at it purely pragmatically, of course we need to reunify. Of course we need to reunify. I mean, as a Pan-Africanist, I'm for the unification of all Africa based on this precise problem. As we're atomized, separated as individual states, we're picked off and pitted against each other. The reason why Niger had this exploitative relationship with France regarding uranium is because it had no other option. It's because if it wasn't getting the uranium from Niger, it would get it from one of the other 54 African countries. We need a unified policy. Right now, we're asking for a seat at the United Nations Security Council. There's no African representation. How do we ask for a seat as Chad? How do we ask for a seat as Lesotho or Zambia? But imagine if we were 54 African countries with united demand and say, no, while we have no representation, we're cutting off all trade for 90 days until you take us seriously. You have more negotiating power. We're 1.4 billion people. China's 1.4 billion. India's 1.3 billion. So to say it can't be done is nonsensical. It can be done. And these countries are strong. And now India's GDP is bigger than its former colonial power, the United Kingdom. China is, based on purchasing power, the largest economy in the world. United bloc. We can negotiate. We can we can unite our resources. We can unite our militaries. We can fight this devastating problem of terrorism. The AES is trying to unite as free countries to fight what many people call the Western-backed terrorist forces in the Sahel. If it was 54 countries, these forces would be defeated within a week, within a month. So yeah, unification is always better. And as we're atomized, we're weak and we're easily picked off and exploited.
Of course, I mean, that's what we saw in the Middle East with Sykes-Picot, this plan to break up all these countries into smaller little nations where people are less united. And, you know, we're seeing that now with the plans for Syria, what happened in Iraq, and who knows what will happen next. But I really want to move on to Nigeria now because, hey, Nicki Minaj, out of all people, recently spoke at the UN, at the United Nations, highlighting the plight of Nigeria's Christian community. And, you know, she claimed that there is a systematic campaign against them amounting to a genocide. And just like in Sudan, that right conservative movement in the US was kind of, you know, pulled together to support the Christians there. I see the same thing kind of taking place again in Nigeria. So during her speech, she thanked President Trump for standing up for Nigeria's Christians. She went on Twitter to do the same thing. And people, of course, went at her because where was she when Israel was wiping out the most historic Christians in Gaza, the ones that are directly linked to Jesus and Mary's bloodline? So what do you make of this event, Ahmed? Is what Trump and Nicki Minaj are saying, is it true? I mean, is there a genocide against Christians in Nigeria? And what exactly is going on?
There's not a genocide, but there are killings of all groups. So animist groups, Muslim groups, Christian groups. And this comes from the fact of the Nigerian state is weak. It's badly mismanaged. There are people with economic grievances. The north is severely underdeveloped. Nigeria has some of the worst statistics you could find. It has the most people living in extreme poverty in the world. It overtook India, and India has 5 times the population. It's the worst place for mothers to give birth, the highest maternal mortality. It has high illiteracy rates. By all measures, it's a failed government. Yeah. And they know this because they've been part of pushing client states and client leaders. The most recent one, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who's mentioned in the WikiLeaks files as being a CIA asset, who's the current president of Nigeria. That's another example of what we talked about before. It's the famous saying by Henry Kissinger: being an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but being our friend is fatal. Because if they're pushing this on Nigeria, where they've got their friend sitting at the helm, then what hopes do the US's enemies have? But yeah, there's a couple of problems. Obviously, there's the Boko Haram insurgency. There's also a bandit problem, which is related to land disputes, what with nomadic tribes, who, you know, I don't want to give them any legitimacy because they've got none, but out of economic desperation, they've been attacking and looting and stealing. And this also comes as the backdrop of 2011. What happened in 2011? They funded the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They encouraged rebels from all over the world, but particularly in Africa, to flood to Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. After they overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in a country as large as Libya, what happened to all those weapons? They obviously got sold in the black market. Now Africa has become the epicenter of a terrorism problem, which we didn't have before 2011. We're now seeing a terrorist threat in Burkina Faso, a terrorist threat in Mali, a terrorist threat in Niger, a terrorist threat in the Central African Republic, terrorist threat in Chad. These places didn't have terrorism problems before 2011. Of course, the US doesn't include this in their analysis. You know, we've made life more difficult for Christians, Muslims, and animists, and all Africans because of our 2011 backing of militant Takfiri rebel groups in Libya. So yeah, I mean, and Nicki Minaj's involvement, I don't know what to say. It's so opportunistic, and devoid of any real compassion, because you mentioned the Palestinian Christians. We could also mention the Syrian Christians, who, after the guy that was shooting basketball hoops in Washington, al-Sharah, Ahmed al-Sharah, formerly known as al-Jalani, after his group of terrorist fighters took over Syria, what did we see happen to Christians? What did we see happen to Alawites? What did we see happen to Druze? Where was Nicki Minaj then? It's clearly about the oil in Nigeria, the mineral wealth in Nigeria, and they don't like the idea that not the Nigerian government, but Nigerian businessmen have been taking economic decisions for Nigeria's sovereignty. Who am I talking about? A guy called Dangote is an oil baron. I'm not usually a fan of billionaire oil barons, but one of the things that he did was he was like, this is ridiculous. We're the biggest oil producer in Africa, yet we export oil, but then we import fuel. How does that make any sense? Why don't we have any oil refineries in Nigeria? And of course, this sent a huge shockwave to the multinational oil companies, because they're like, well, if this happens in Nigeria, this might happen in Angola, this might happen in South Sudan, this might happen in many of the other countries, Libya, where they have huge oil reserves. So I think it's about putting Nigeria back in its place. It's about securing mineral wealth in Nigeria and securing long-term oil interest in Nigeria. It's not about Nigerian Christians. And also, it's not about Nigerians, because it's not just Christians that are being killed.
I want to play this video of how Malcolm X saw somebody like Nicki Minaj.
I just told you a little while ago, these leaders that they call leaders, this included Lena Horne, this included Dick Gregory, and this included comedians, comics, trumpet players, baseball players. Show me in the white community where a comedian is a white leader. Show me in the white community where a singer is a white leader, or a dancer or a trumpet player is a white leader. These aren't leaders. These are puppets and clowns that have been set up over the white community and over the black community by the white community, and have been made celebrities and usually say exactly what they know that the white man wants to hear.
I would like to thank President Trump for prioritizing this issue and for his leadership on the global stage in calling for urgent action to defend Christians in Nigeria, to combat extremism, and to bring a stop to violence against those who simply want to exercise their natural right to freedom of religion or belief.
So what's crazy about all of this is that Trump is threatening to intervene in Nigeria, but actually Nigeria has been one of Washington's closest allies in the region, especially under President Bola Tinubu. So usually it is, when the US wants to intervene in a country, it's countries that are aligned with Iran or North Korea or Venezuela. And in this case, it's actually the complete opposite. So then also Nigeria is a key member of the ECOWAS, which is the Western Approved Economic and Military Alliance. Could you tell us a little bit more about the US-Nigeria relationship under Tinubu?
Yeah, I mean, so when there was the revolutionary coup that happened in Nigeria, which is obviously English-speaking country, I say that because usually France's client states in the region are the former Francophone countries, was pushing for ECOWAS, which is a bloc which is dominated and controlled by France, to invade Niger and reinstall the French-backed president, Mohamed Bazoum. And that's what started the AES. So Burkina Faso and Mali said, if you invade Niger, you'll have to invade us too, because when it comes to Niger's defense. And so that started the military cooperation between the three countries, which then led to a military cooperation to fight against the terrorist groups, which then led to the economic cooperation. And now we see AES, where their foreign policy is mirrored. If you do something in one country, if you know, when they had their problem with Ukraine, the Burkina Faso and Mali, when Mali had a problem with Ukraine, Burkina Faso and Mali also issued statements of condemnation. So what's actually one of the theories, that this isn't about Nigeria at all. This is really about Niger and really about breaking up the AES. I mentioned it earlier, Eritrea was the only country to not have a military-to-military alliance with AFRICOM. The second country was Niger. So it stands out in the sense of fantastic things have happened in Burkina Faso and Mali, but they kicked out the French. It's impressive, but France is not the US. The US is a whole nother power. Niger kicked out the French and the US. And as you mentioned before, there's something called the threat of the bad example. Yeah, the reason why they're determined to take over Venezuela, the reason why they're determined to take over Nicaragua and Iran and all these other places, is it's not just about what's going on in those countries. It's about the threat of the bad example that someone else might copy. Someone else might do their own Bolivarian revolution. Somewhere else in the region might have their own Islamic revolution, like what happened in Iran. And what they're worried about Niger is, hold on a second, if Niger is able to kick out our largest drone base in Africa, to say that they don't want to have any military cooperation with AFRICOM, what happens if other countries follow suit? What happens if Djibouti, which hosts a huge US base, follows suit? What happens if Liberia follows suit? So yeah, it does seem odd that it would attack an ally like this and threaten to attack an ally like this. But how the US operates, many people are saying, yeah, they might be talking about Nigeria, but don't be surprised if this is really about the AES and really about punishing Niger of daring to take a sovereign decision and deciding who its military partners should be and who its military partners won't be.
Well, yeah, and Nigeria in general is just such an interesting country because 59% of the country actually holds a positive view of Israel. Nigeria is a very close ally of the state of Israel. And we have also Chevron, I think it's Chevron, correct me if I'm wrong, that's operating also inside of Nigeria, you know, taking up all that oil. And if you actually look at what's happening in the places where Nigeria is extracting the oil, or Chevron is extracting the oil, it's like there's like miles longs of like slums, people living in abstract poverty. Like it's such a perfect example of how like neoliberalism, I guess you could say, took over a country, brought the corporations in, allied it with Israel. Now it's like this kind of propped up, you know, US-backed country. And that's what the results are people living in this abstract poverty while these, you know, the hawks come in. Anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what you just mentioned is a place called the Niger Delta region, where it's not just Chevron, it's Shell, it's ExxonMobil, it's Total, all of them. It's been a field day. And there was a real climate change activist in Nigeria, who were protesting against this. And we have released documents that show that Shell pushed the military dictatorship of Nigeria at the time to push to execute these people. So you know, in many ways, Nigeria is not a real state. It's a neo-colonialist wet dream. Yeah, it never had any revolutionary leadership. It has all the potential in the world. So I've said this on a previous podcast, but look at how Nigerians perform outside the country. In the UK, year on year, Nigerian students, there's one family where each one of the family members had managed to get into Oxford by the time they were like 11 years old. They managed to score the highest score in their GCSEs. I think there's a similar story happened in Netherlands, and similar things happens in the US. But Nigerians in Nigeria can't achieve because the state is so weak, so run down, so driven by austerity measures, so reliant on IMF loans and structural adjustment programs, that it can't do anything to the huge potential that it has. 210 million people, young population, brilliant minds, but starved by neo-colonial puppet regime after neo-colonial puppet regime. We're just hoping that the latest threats by Trump has just woke a few people up. Because if, like we've mentioned, if they can do this and threaten and essentially delegitimize their client, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, then what's the point of being a client? You might as well take a revolutionary path. The Ibrahim Traore, the Abdurrahman Tiani, the Asima Gota have taken in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Because if you don't, they'll still come after you anyway.
And there's a small group of, I mean, I don't know if they're super small, but there's a group of Shias inside of Nigeria who've also been heavily persecuted, led by Ibrahim al-Zakzaki. He's a Shia leader inside of Nigeria who has strongly disagreed with the stance of the government allying itself with the state of Israel. And he's actually called for unity with the Christians there. And he has supported resistance groups, of course. But he and his family have been targeted. I mean, I think the Nigerian military actually executed his sons in front of him. And what can you tell us about Zakzaki and this kind of Nigerian alliance with the state of Israel and how that's affected the country?
Yeah, I mean, Sheikh Zakzaki has been persecuted, arrested. You mentioned it right. His son has been killed. The thing is, when you're running a heist, you're very worried about any potential popular movement that's going to recognize this as a heist and convince other people that this is a heist. So Nigeria has always persecuted community activists, community leadership. One of my former African Stream colleagues, David Hoyunde, he's an exile. He can't go back to Nigeria because he helped to expose Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been a US CIA asset way back from when he was the governor of Lagos. So the persecution of Sheikh Zakzaki didn't start with Bola Ahmed Tinubu. It's been going on from successive Nigerian governments, precisely because it's not a real state. It's a robbery of Nigeria's resources by European Western elites with the collaboration of the middlemen who happen to be the Nigerian leadership, the Nigerian governance, the governor of Lagos, the Nigerian president, the Nigeria foreign minister, etc. And Nigeria is one of those countries where they know the state has been systematically robbed because every single one of them goes abroad for their medical treatment. Yeah, Bola Ahmed Tinubu just came back from a foreign trip for his medical treatment. Buhari, his predecessor, was always in London for his medical treatment. How can you be the president of your country, but you're saying our public services, our private services are trash? I'm going to go abroad. You have the power to change that, but they don't change that. It's such a level of corruption that it affects the elites. That's what I'd say the difference is. There's corruption obviously that happens in Western capitals every single day, but they don't rob so much that they have to go on bad roads. They have to travel on the same potholes as everybody else. They have to land in the same beaten up airport. They have to go to the same hospital. So it's corruption that is even detrimental to themselves. And that's what's so exceptional about Nigeria.
Well, then we have the opposite spectrum, right? The opposite political spectrum happening in West Africa, where we have Burkina Faso, the small landlocked country, which is ruled by a revolutionary leader, which is Ibrahim Traore. Traore has made a name for himself around the world, preaching Pan-Africanism and content-wide revolution, so popular that even the BBC described him as an African Che Guevara, and noted that he has captured the hearts and minds around the world. What have you made of him?
Yeah, I mean, he's remarkable. He obviously gets most of the plaudits because he's a handsome guy, speaks very well. But all three of the leaders are really remarkable. All three of the leaders are doing exceptional things. And Ibrahim Traore is very keen on sharing the limelight as well, because what's going on in the Sahel is revolutionary and it's inspirational. The example that I give, I lived in Ghana in 2015, and President Mahama was the president of Ghana then. He got the role because he was the vice president, and the president had passed away, so he became the president. He then lost his seat and was out of office for 8 years. He's now re-elected as the president of Ghana. Mahama today is completely different to Mahama of 2015. That's because at his inauguration, he invited Captain Ibrahim Traore. The loudest cheer from the Ghanaian masses was for Ibrahim Traore. And you could literally see it on the face of Mahama. I want some of this. Whatever this young man is selling, whatever this Pan-Africanism, this revolution, I'm an old man. I want to be cheered by the masses. I want to be adored by the masses. So he started to take a more revolutionary path. And that's the power of what's going on in the AES. We're seeing time and time again an attempt to mirror what's going on in the AES, not mirror it in any real sense, obviously with lipstick and lip gloss, but the fact that they're trying to show the people that we're the next Ibrahim Traore, we're the next Asima Gota, we're the next Tiani, shows the powerful influence that the AES is having. We saw that just recently where there was a fake coup that happened in Guinea-Bissau, where the revolutionary group, the PAIGC, was banned from standing in the presidential election. So then they endorsed a candidate called Diaz, who won the election. And when he won the election, the incumbent president basically orchestrated a fake coup, hoping that the people could be fooled into thinking this is a revolutionary coup like what's happened in the AES. Of course, we have comrades on the ground that are members of the PAIGC who explained it to us, and we've got the word out, and other comrades have got the word out. But it just goes to show the influence, the influence that it's having on the continent. Unfortunately, it's not having the level of influence that we would like and fast enough, but it's only been, a few years since the AES has formed. So who knows how it will transpire. I interviewed Musa Ibrahim, who was Gaddafi's former spokesman, and he said, if only the AES was around while Gaddafi was around, could you imagine what they could do in that Sahel region together? With Gaddafi's resources and the revolutionary leadership of these three countries and the critical mass mobilization and support that they have internally. But anyway, it's remarkable. And the most important thing I'll say is, he gives impressive speeches, of course he does. He says impressive stuff, but it's infrastructure. What I think people forget about Africa, if you travel through Africa, infrastructure is the most important thing. We don't need Western style democracy where we have a two-party system where the best funded candidate, the one that gets himself on most billboards, wins the election. We need infrastructure. We need roads. We need bridges. This is the things that affect everyone's lives. How do you have education in places where 80% of the population, like in Niger, didn't have access to the electrical grid? What can you do? Think of all of the great minds and the talent that doesn't able to reach their potential. How do people from the north of country travel to the capital to sell their goods if there's no roads? If the roads are too bad? if the roads are so bad where it should take you 3 hours to get there, but it takes you 12 hours, it's only once you travel for the continent do you realize how important infrastructure is. And that's what Captain Ibrahim Traore has focused on: paving roads, building factories, trying to make Burkina Faso food sovereign, setting up cooperatives. This is what people are excited about, because they've seen decades of the previous dictator, Blaise Compaoré, doing absolutely nothing, building nothing, setting up a few French cafes so that when the French ambassador wants to go out to eat, that he has somewhere to eat. But beyond that, no real development. And now we're seeing real development, real infrastructure, and that's what people are excited about.
And do you foresee any sort of like buildup by, U.S. proxies from the United States to Israel or others to weaken the Burkina Faso state because of this?
It's very difficult for them to do it because although the narrative is fake and false, in 2001, after the September 11th attacks, they said, we are fighting a war on terror. We are fighting a war on terror. So if they do anything to topple the three countries who are the epicenter of this fight against terror, it would expose, I mean, we already know they're hypocrites, but it would expose another level of hypocrisy, because you can't, they always need a narrative to sell. They can't say Ibrahim Traore is a terrorist. He's obviously fighting a terrorist. Can they go down the Maduro route and say he's a narco trafficker? Maybe, but they need to plant seeds, and those seeds would need to grow many years from now. So they don't really have the narrative. They're through mud against the wall to see what sticks. Nothing stuck so far. Yeah, they've initially tried to say that he's using the gold of the country to enrich himself. We saw mass mobilization against that. We saw protests in London. We saw protests in the US. We saw an attempted protest in Nigeria, but it was shut down by the government before it got going. All in defense of Ibrahim Traore, so that didn't work. Then they tried to say he's targeting the Fulani tribe in Burkina Faso, which doesn't make sense because Fulanis are part of the government. That didn't work. The latest one that they've tried to weaken his support from progressives and leftist movements against the world is Ibrahim Traore is a homophobe. He's pushed through this anti-LGBT law. I mean, again, it doesn't stick because look at who the US's allies are. Is homosexuality legal in Saudi Arabia? Is it legal in Qatar? Is it legal in any of these places where, the US has got strong alliance with? So to single out Ibrahim Traore out of all the countries that have anti-LGBTQ laws is clearly an attempt of putting a pink face on imperialism. Of course, it has worked with a few liberals in the US. I've seen it on a few of our posts, like, oh, he's anti this and he's anti that. But by and large, it's not enough to lay the groundwork, to make the ground fertile for some sort of military intervention. It doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future, but they just need a better excuse than they've got now.
Well, Ahmed Kaballo, you have been such a wealth of information and knowledge and just wisdom from the African region. So we really appreciate you being on here. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I learn so much from you and from your perspective. And do you have, African Stream was obviously shut down. We'd love to hear what your next plans are, where people can find your work and how people can support you, and we'll wrap it up from there.
Sure. So I've set up something different called Sovereign Media, a new media platform. It's a media platform on its own right, but it's also part of a coalition in which we're supporting other media outlets, and other media outlets are supporting us. And the idea is that we would form an anti-imperialist coalition of media outlets, so that when something like what happened to Mint Press the other day happens, when they try to deplatform Sovereign Media or an African Stream, we can unite and amplify and all raise the banner and at least expose the hypocrisy and demand that these Silicon Valley tech bros think twice before they go after one of us. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. You can follow us on Sovereign Media on all platforms. And you can also follow our coalition partners, which consist of Venezuela Analysis, Child Collective, Black Agenda Report, Aminico Tribune, and many more.
That's amazing. And just a reminder that just because they shut down one platform, we're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. Your voice is stronger than ever. It's extremely important that people follow the work that you do. And we really appreciate you being here, Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.